For the longest time, I've informed you that the mission of the New Voices of Black Media is to take control of the social discourse within the black community and to elevate the debate. There are a number of issues that we can bring light to, but instead of people basically saying, would you guys build schools and such, the black community as a whole focuses on that. The job of the New Voices of Black Media is to be that voice talking to the black community, saying this is what we need, this is what we need to stay away from, and this is how we need to go about doing things. And you got to make sure that if you're going to have a media, that it says the right things. And you're the one who has to determine that. You can't just go listening to any old voice. For too long, black people have been allowed to talk without actually having to know what the hell they're even talking about. And this is why we've been so easily misled. We've allowed the village idiots to have as much right to speak as the wisest man in town. We've allowed a disease to take hold of us and to totally derange what should be a harmonious internal monologue. That disease is intellectual laziness and moral cowardice. We let big-mouthed morons talk because too many of us are just too lazy to learn the facts, and worse than that, unwilling to accept what needs to be done when it's plainly obvious what action needs to be taken. We've allowed white supremacy to give us a false memory of the past. We've allowed them to erase us from the places where we actually were, from Kemet to today what is called Europe and even the Americas. But these lies almost pale in comparison to the lies that we've allowed a certain group of morons within our community to indoctrinate us with. Yes, we have an entire phalanx, a whole army, entire armies of bootlicks and turncoats slithering amongst us. But we need to be honest about the fact that we have had a feeble, inadequate response to this treason within. We suffer fools gladly. And for some damn reason, we tolerate people who clearly don't have a clue what they're talking about. We let them talk to the point that they begin to influence us as a group. This is why black conversations are usually lowbrow conversations, low IQ conversations, because the people who we choose to listen to in too many cases don't have the sense that God gave a dog. We're not looking for intelligent conversation because that would simply ask far too much of us. And rather than shout these idiots down whenever they raise their empty heads, instead of shutting them down when they try to distract and derail us, we instead dignify their treasonous distractions by allowing them to keep on talking whatever nonsense they want. We just sit on our hands and allow all measure of childish, immature, treasonous, and just plain idiotic banter to take place. Every one of our conversations becomes a comedy routine. I'm talking about what's supposed to be serious conversation, what passes for serious conversation among us. How many times have you seen one of the New Voices of Black Media taking part in a so-called interview or some sort of group discussion, and someone, usually the so-called host in many cases, will start making stupid jokes, will be giggling for no reason, and otherwise trying to make things into a time for laughter. Well, the suffering of our people ain't a joke. And this is what the currently existing black media does and has always done. And you see they're tools of white supremacy. The conversation has been relegated to a base guttural level, and the people who present so-called black media to you are the ones working to keep it in the sewer. They do it because that's the only thing that they understand. That's what got them their jobs. White media uses these morons as sock puppets, and being the idiots that they are, they're used to pretending that they're the best and brightest when in reality they're the scum under the bottom of the barrel. White supremacy has monopolized the world's resources, and they use this position to pick and choose who they want to win, to stack the deck in the favor of whomever is most expedient to their goals. Black bootlicks for white supremacy love to tell themselves that they've got a few pennies for white supremacy because they're just so smart. Yeah, LeBron James and Tyler Perry are clearly black America's best and brightest minds. Brains is not what determines whether you're financially well off under white supremacy. White supremacy was set up precisely to take the guesswork out of that equation. It was set up precisely in order to guarantee economic and social rewards, regardless of how hard you work. Success is determined solely on whether they think you're of use to them. So suck it up, all the coons. You can coon it up and suck up to white power all you want. It may make you feel good, but you're not winning. You were just chosen to get a couple of pennies off their table. None of these clowns is smart enough to elevate the conversation, so that's why whenever they wind up in a conversation with the new voices of black media, these guys get angry. They start trying to throw around insults because they're finally seeing what an informed black person actually sounds like, and they know that their audience is hearing it, and they know that this is a breath of fresh air, and they got to find a way to throw some dirt on these new voices. They realize they don't qualify as intelligent and that they never will. They know that their audience is seeing this, and they're wondering, well, how do I get my audience to not see this guy or not see these people as being the new thing that they ought to be following? It's a shock to the bootlicks because they're so woefully outclassed, and they realize the longer the conversation goes on, the worse they look. These black bootlicks are exactly like their white masters. When the white guys actually decided to try and take on black men in athletics, they got whipped by a country mile. Now, this may have come as a surprise to them, but it was no surprise to us at all. White people have been lying to themselves about black inferiority. The propaganda arm of white supremacy, the white media, created a bubble of lies about black inferiority, and white people lapped it up. And they decided to furnish this bubble with all manner of self-aggrandizing falsehoods and black denigration fare. The white majority didn't hear anything to the contrary of these lies, and they were not willing to hear anything to the contrary. They were white, and hence fair, and if they said they were better, then that meant they were. End of discussion. Well, the black bootlicks are indeed auxiliaries of white supremacy, and you can tell by how they lied to themselves about how good they thought they were. They didn't know what a real intelligent conversation was like because they'd never had to have one. And they themselves are not intelligent, so they're totally unequipped and unqualified to lead, much less engage in an intelligent conversation. They're buffoons, and they act like it. Now, that may be good enough for them, but should it be good enough for us? Do we, as the intelligent black people of the world, deserve better? Now, the question is, will we insist upon better? Because a media that's actually worthy of us, that's not going to just sprout out of the ground. We're going to have to make it to happen. You never see any other group allowing the kind of feculent conversation and discourse that we just sit back and suffer. The most popular talk format for white people is talk radio, and I don't care if it's Rush Limbaugh or Randy Rhoads, nobody is trying to make their audience laugh. Even Howard Stern has decided that he ain't doing that anymore. When white people are talking to one another, the conversation is always dead serious. When black people are talking to one another, however, the conversation's always a joke. Black people were robbed of our power, and now we've become terrified of ever having to exercise power. We're too scared to pay the price that power demands in order to acquire it, too intellectually lazy to think beyond whatever mental plantation we've taken refuge inside, and wouldn't know what to do with power even if we got it. Reversing this suicidal mentality has to be the first priority of any so-called black media. Call this disease out and root it out. But instead we allow every Tom, Dick, and Harry with diarrhea of the mouth to stand in front of us and chatter away nonsensically, and this non-stop barrage of idiocy becomes what passes for black social discourse. It's time for that to stop. We don't need a low-tolerant zone. We need a no-tolerant zone. And if the morons don't like that, tough. These big-mouthed fools are not slaves. They're traitors. They're the enemy within. They're too dumb to lead, too ignorant to follow. What the hell good are they? Absolutely none. So So they're not going to have any place among us. We're going to make it a point that they will not be anywhere near us. We exile these traitors. Every time black people come together to get an agenda on the table, there's two groups who can always be counted on to crash the party: the white supremacists and their hand-picked functionaries, the black enemy within. Instead of talking about group economics, the conversation is always hijacked and derailed. We get shunted onto talking about gay marriage, or black-brown alliances, or kundalini energy, or education, or some other bit of detritus that has nothing to do with anything. And we have to understand that this is not okay. We have to call out this behavior when it happens and start calling these people traitors when they do it. And we have to be forceful about it. We have to be dictatorial about it. We have to make sure that we're uncompromising about it. We don't need to have any sort of patience with these clowns. Time is of the essence. We don't have the time, nor should we have the patience for people who are actively working against our power. Power doesn't take an opinion poll. Power doesn't conduct any survey to see how many people approve. Power is not something you ask for. It is something you assume. Because the idiots who are whining about how, man, this seems heavy-handed, y'all ain't listening to nobody else. These are the same morons who have been slamming their gums for the last 150 years and haven't produced a damn thing, and they're not going to. They're the ones who always slither into our gatherings, into our groupings. They're the ones who always come sniffing around like a dog, hoping somebody's going to give them a few free bones. They're the ones who come into where it is that we have gathered together and then start working against what we're doing, because they know a going concern when they see one. They understand that this is where the energy is at, this is where the power is at, that Black America may have a group of people who actually have their heads on straight, and that group of people may be a minority, but if they come together, the way that they behave, a group of black people with their heads on straight, that's not a minority. That's an elite. And as I've tried to teach you, the difference between a minority and an elite is power. A small group of people who have the ability to exercise disproportionate power, that's not a minority, that's an elite. That's why nobody calls the 1% a minority. Dictatorial. You want to know what you call that? You call it taking control of the social discourse. Part of power is a perpetual, non-stop refinement. You're not trying to figure out how to get impurities and all sorts of detritus into the mix. You're trying to figure out how to get it out and keep it out. And for those of you who don't pay very good attention, taking control of the social discourse, that is the first tenet of our mission statement. You can spout whatever line of idiocy you want so long as it doesn't require people to actually do anything. That happens to be the credo of the bootlicks chatterati. These two diseases of intellectual laziness and moral cowardice, they've metastasized to the point that most black people have become determined that they won't participate in nor allow any conversation that actually requires them to build. Because that's the problem they got whenever you got folks like us talking about real power and what has to be done to get it. As far as they're concerned, they can see on the horizon, oh, I got to stop it with all this gutter stuff, all this ghetto stuff. I've acquired a taste for being a bottom feeder. I'm just looking for a comfortable place under white supremacy. They gonna have to take care of us or we'll be in the streets. Yeah, and white supremacy has a plan for that. Because they know you're going to be in the streets barehanded. Because you didn't bother to build any institutions that would have equipped you to defend yourself. And so, as far as black discourse is going, as far as black discourse is concerned, we've popularized talking around the adult, mature conversations that need to take place. We allow others to distract us, to tear down the constructive conversation that we're trying to promote. But they know that they're totally unequipped to do the hard work that power requires, so they're trying to stop us from getting that agenda moving. And it's because white supremacy has taken care of these bottom feeders to some extent or another. They know that we're not going to take care of them at all. They understand that the thinning of the herd is going to be completely and thoroughly uncompromising, just like our discourse is. They know that they're going to be seen as what they've always been, counter to our interest. And that when black people start wielding power, it's going to be all about the interests. You're going to be in one of two categories, either an asset or a liability. Liabilities get eliminated. These enemies within, they depend on white power to sustain them and keep them afloat. The hood rat, dusty dudes contingent, they depend on white power for government handouts or for menial jobs at a white company. These guys are the cockroaches of the world, and they're comfortable with that. They've adjusted to being cockroaches, and they want for you and me to go ahead and join them scurrying underneath the furniture. But there's also another group of individuals who happen to be dependent on white power who work against us, the more allegedly educated enemies within, the Marc Lamont Hills or the leftist LGBTQRSTUV types. They'll come in and tell us that we need to make accepting leftist ideology our priority. Now, don't worry about that black empowerment thing. We need a worldwide coalition. They've been talking that crap since the 19th century. They've been talking that crap since Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson and all those. They've been talking that garbage a damn long time. Just out of curiosity, when is the great socialist revolution ever going to demand that the socialists stop being racist? When the hell is that going to happen? If socialism wants to eliminate class differences, they can start with eliminating their own internal racial class differences. How about that one, huh? We need multiracial alliances, and if Palestine's not free, then black people aren't free either, and what about the gays? And if that's what your educated black people do. They've learned a bunch of more allegedly sophisticated talking points, but geared toward the same thing as the dusty hood rats. Getting us off the ball, getting our eye off the ball, distracting us onto all sorts of irrelevant minutia. Both of these groups, they want to argue, offer up meaningless denials, which even they have to admit is based on nothing. And when that fails, they try to say, well, black empowerment isn't very friendly. Black empowerment's not very nice. Well, as Dr. Claude Anderson put it, it's not about loving everybody. I'm nobody's eugenicist, but I do believe that you can have too many idiots among you. Whether the cause of their idiocy is genetic or a failure of intellectual rigor is irrelevant, and there's no way to fix stupid, so I'm not even going to waste time trying. Yes, the conversation is not friendly and cuddly. We're at war, stupid. That's the reason why. We've been at war for 500 years. Our conversation and discourse needs to be on the nose, bare knuckles, iron rigid, and going into your guts like a blade. That's where our conversation needs to be. It needs to be geared around a certain amount of aggression, uncompromising aggression. But the reason that we keep getting all of these distractions, you got a lot of these educated Negroes, the ones who white media tries to present as being our mouthpieces on the airwaves. In many cases, most of these people are bisexuals and homosexuals and pansexuals and transsexuals and any other kind of sexuals you got, everything except for heterosexual. That they are not. Like Marc Lamont Hill. And their ilk are hoping to curry the favor of their white leftist pals. And in the case of Marc Lamont Hill or a Byron Allen, these guys who clearly are undercover homosexuals like Barack Obama, in the case of Marc Lamont Hill, he's a tenured professor. So as he sees it, he's got job security, and his white butt kissing is paid off, so he's good, he's straight. And there's plenty of others hoping to get whatever white brass ring that they're striving for, but nowhere in their agenda does black empowerment ever feature. Marc Lamont Hill's trying the same thing as Roly-Poly Martin. He's calling himself talking tough because his benefactors over at CNN decided they were going to cut him off. So he's pretending to talk tough. But it's all the same scam. As far as he's concerned, if he can get black people just to follow him and listen to him by any means, even if he has to pretend as if all of a sudden he's suddenly discovered that white supremacy is a problem, Then as far as he's concerned, hey, he can go back to his white pals over at CNN and say, well, guys, I've got a following again, and if you guys don't do right by me, well, I'm going to have my following go ahead and sick them on you just to show you I got some power. We are the best and brightest, truly the best and brightest, but even here, among our ranks, you find that there's a distinct lack of nerve, a distinct lack of intestinal fortitude. And this gives rise to all manner of excuse making. Black people, and I'm going to be talking to black men in specific here because we are the thought leaders for our group. Black men have become utter cowards on a whole variety of fronts. Lazy cowards. And a coward is always looking for a lie that they can hide behind in order to justify their cowardice. One of the main lies that black men try to hide behind for why it is that, oh, this economics thing, that ain't gonna work. They always try to hide behind the destruction of the Black Wall Streets, specifically the one in Tulsa. You can always be guaranteed that they're gonna pull that one out. They don't know a damn thing about the Black Wall Street in Tulsa. They don't know who was there, what businesses they had, how lucrative those businesses were. They don't know anything about it except for, well, them white folks came and went after them. So, well, if you got some well-to-do Negroes, that ain't gonna mean nothing. White supremacy gonna just go ahead and run over y'all. And you can tell that they're glad for that. There's a certain amount of glee that you can hear in their voices whenever they bring up that example, because what they think is, this is my bulletproof excuse that I'm gonna hide behind. You're scaring me with all this talk about building, so I need to find an example of white folks attacking black people who were building so I can have an excuse for why I'm not going to get up and do anything. Let me tell you something. If you're one of the idiots who's tried to wave the bloody flag of the destruction of Black Wall Street as your excuse to ward off any responsibility for building power, you're found out, okay? You're not fooling anyone. Your little sighting of the Black Wall Street, that's not a justification, it's an excuse for your cowardice, for why you're not going to fight. You want to surrender and you're going to use this as your excuse. That's what these clowns are really saying. They want to shuck and jive and act like teenage delinquents full time, so they demand that the conversation be kept at a juvenile reprobate level, mostly about sex and sexuality. Hey, talk about gender warring, why you can't get a date on a Friday night, talk about religion, talk about whether we want to focus exclusively on whether or not gay is right or wrong. We're going to go ahead and focus on all this stuff about crotch, talk about religion, talk about your kundalini energy, but whatever you do, don't talk about adult grown-up affairs like acquiring and maintaining power, because that will require brain cells. You can't do that with a kindergarten mentality. So don't talk about that. Don't bring all that power talk around here. Oh, I see some black folks over there talking about building. They sound serious. Well, I don't want that kind of conversation over here, so I'm going to go over there and I'm going to see if I can distract them. Talk about something else. Let me see if I can get their eye off the ball. These bootlicks are scared, all right. They're terrified, in fact, but it's not white supremacy or even white people who they're scared of. It's black people who they're terrified of. Black people who want power. Black people who have decided that it's time to get up and fight for our piece of the world, and that we will have it, not by any means necessary, but by any means possible, and that we are fully willing and committed and prepared to pay the price that power demands. They're terrified that for them it's game over, because they want to be cockroaches. Well, they prefer to be cockroaches for white power, though they'll be cockroaches for Asians or Hispanics in a pinch. Well, if all else fails, maybe they can find a way to suck up to some black folks who got their act together, but they reserve the right, though, to be completely obstinate and belligerent. Yeah, they'll go ahead. Maybe they will occasionally, once every blue moon, if they have no other choice, if you're standing over with a sledgehammer, maybe they'll carry a little bit of water for black empowerment, but don't expect them to follow orders without bucking back a few times. Don't expect them to follow orders without giving you all sorts of pushback. They reserve the right to do that because, you know, we're black folks and, well, we should be able to do that. Yeah, you're not going to be giving pushback to white supremacy. You're not going to be giving any sort of pushback to the burgeoning Asian supremacy or to Hispanic belligerence, but with black folks, well, I got to give you some back talk. I got to give you some pushback. Remember the stupid kids in school? You know, the ones who were clearly too dumb to even be in a school, and the only reason that they were there was because the law wouldn't allow their parents to let them roam the streets. So the school system devolved into a daycare system for idiots. And the stupid kids freely disrupted class, starting fights, distracting the students. They got one another pregnant, anything but learning. That's the one thing that they didn't do. That was the one thing the stupid kids never did because they were incapable of doing it. But the stupid kids took comfort in knowing that society had a life path for them too. Granted, it was straight into a prison cell, but at least society had a path for them. Didn't just turn them out in the wilderness to die. You can tell that a lot of black men enjoy hiding behind the excuse of the destruction of the Black Wall Street. Well, let me tell you something. The Black Wall Street's destruction was indeed a tragic chapter in our history, but it's hardly a reason for not building based on economics. In fact, it proves the legitimacy and the viability of building based on economics. White supremacy saw that, and they, as a group, in a way that they never went after black people before, they said, we have got to go after them systematically. We did something that seriously threatened the bastards. So that tells me that that's the right way to go. In every prior epoch of our history, when our enemies tore down what we built, we rebuilt. And this time we put a few extra defenses in place because we knew that we had something that the wolves were going to come after. So we didn't focus on making excuses for not building. Instead, we devised ways to protect what was ours. And that's something that a black man understands. That is, unless you're a coward who doesn't want to fight in the first place. So anytime some spineless good-for-nothing wants to try to hide behind the Black Wall Street as his excuse for why he doesn't want to do group economics, that's a traitor who outed himself. That is a traitor who is saying that I am speaking treason and I want you to become traitors with me. I'm a turncoat here to do white supremacy's bidding, and I want to see how many of you fools will let me do it. The truth is, you cowardly, lazy bastards wouldn't lift one finger to fight racism, even if I gave you all the money and all the weapons in the world. It's not a lack of monetary resources or military resources that makes them run to their favorite excuse. It is a lack of courage. It is a lack of nerve, a lack of will. That's the real paucity that they face. Yes, white men have put institutions in place that have benefited the white masses. And yes, they have used these as the money and the muscle to oppress us, but you might want to actually take a real mature look at how they were able to do that. Because white supremacy is a recent development on the world stage. Most of their history has been them hoarding resources from one another, white people keeping resources from each other. The situation had gotten so bad that by the close of the 15th century, Europe was a disease-riddled, impoverished little patch of dirt. There's a lot of talk, especially from President Tangerine, about countries that are S-holes. Well, that would certainly describe what Europe was just 500 years ago. Dirty, ignorant masses of peasants revolting left and right. Well, that is when they weren't falling dead from all manner of diseases. You might want to take a look sometime at where the STDs by and large came from. They largely came as a result of individuals in Europe who were getting a little bit too friendly with the livestock. Many of the STDs getting passed around today and for a long time are in fact a result of animals that had been violated by some of these good sheep herders and goat herders in Europe. Even AIDS originally was a white disease. The first confirmed case of AIDS, patient 0, was in fact a French Canadian. Look it up. So when you start talking about diseases and impoverishment, yeah, that sure does sound about white to me. And the rulers of Europe prior to the 16th century, these guys were not rich at all. They were just the least poor people in a land with no resources. So they had two problems: a kingdom with no riches and tons of angry people beating down their doors. people who they had no intention of ever treating humanely. This is the picture of Europe at the close of the 15th century. These guys didn't have some elaborate places that they were in. They had freaking barns. You might want to take a look at what the British Parliament was prior to 200 years ago. These guys were in a freaking barn. And you see movies like Lord of the Rings, they try to show you these Nordic strongholds. Man, that's fantasy fare. Mostly what these guys were getting together in were barns. That's what they were doing in freaking Europe. We got to be honest about that. We got to be honest about it because they won't. So if that was the picture of Europe prior to the 16th century, then what changed? Because they sure did seem to change dramatically. Obviously, when you practice hoarding resources, you don't suddenly discover religion. So why was it that these guys all of a sudden were able to get enough generosity in order to give a couple of pennies to their fellow white folks? What changed? Well, what changed is that the white rulers of Europe saw an opportunity to solve two problems at once. They could export their poor and criminal class, who were usually one and the same, out of Europe, which helped to decrease the number of angry mobs banging on their doors, and at the same time they could enrich themselves by stealing the material and human wealth of Africa and the Americas. So they got to get rid of all of their disease-riddled, impoverished, angry masses banging on their doors, and they actually got to have some resources for the first time in their history. They took the same class structure that they had had in Europe, and they instituted it on a global scale. Only this time, instead of only having a handful of armed thugs outside of the king's palace to keep the peasants at bay, now the previously impoverished peasants who were banging on the front door, these guys would become deputized. These guys were going to become enlisted in the king's army of thugs. And they were all going to become a global strong-arm force to go after the indigenous people of Africa and the Americas. One of the things you keep hearing about business is that it has to be scalable. Your idea has to be scalable. Well, that's exactly what white supremacy turned out to be. You had everyone from trained soldiers to white colonial invaders, sometimes called settlers, who would pick up guns and ruthlessly kill any black and brown people who they came across. The European rulers made it clear that they drew little distinction between the king's army and the civilian militia. Daniel Boone wasn't a soldier. He was a so-called frontiersman. And the same went for the so-called father of Anglo-American Texas, Stephen Austin. Yet every time you see a depiction of Daniel Boone, he's always shown holding a musket rifle, leading other white invaders into the land that they sought to steal. He was part of the militia that the founders of the U.S. were talking about in the Constitution. Now, if you didn't have a properly trained army on hand, then all you have to do is have every white man and boy above age 13 and even women pressed into service. This is exactly what they were doing, by the way, having so-called civilians. You and I understand them as nothing more than non-enlisted military. These people were basically a reserve force. In Tasmania, in Australia, in South Africa, you can read about how you had these settlers bragging in their accounts about how the wife and kids were helping to pass ammunition. They were acting as support staff for the white males with the guns who were killing the rightful owners of the land. So they were bragging about what their standard military was doing, what their regular military was doing, and what their irregular military, i.e. their militia, i.e. their settlers, civilians, were doing. The world was to become nothing more than a large-scale global version of the feudal lords of Europe's castles. The dirty peasants would become a global palace guard, and the Africans would become a new global peasant class who the guards would be told to keep in line, in which they would. And while the guards didn't get rich by serving their white masters, they were certainly better off than the peasants, which for these corrupt thugs was sufficient to keep them doing the local warlord's bidding. The European kings' castles and fortresses have all been replaced by mansions and corporate skyscrapers, but the organizational structure put in place 500 years ago hasn't changed one iota. Every once in a while, the palace guard might find that their wages get a little low, and they might start grumbling and mumbling, and the king will be like, okay, give these dogs a few extra pennies. After all, who else is going to be keeping all of these black and brown people, mostly black, at bay? Who's going to be the cannon fodder meant to make sure that the elites, the white ruling class, is always kept insulated from the people who they've harmed the most? That's just the reality of what's been going on. You need to know that because many of you have been thinking that the people who are in fact the new Castle Guard are somehow your friends. Well, please tell me, if you guys are all friends, then at what point do you get to become part of the Castle Guard? Or better yet, when do you get to become one of the kings? I mean, since everything's all hunky-dory and all. The entire world has been turned into the exact same sick, perverted feudal structure of medieval Europe. The Dark Ages of Europe never came to an end. They just went global. The European warlords simply made their peasantry into part of a greatly expanded castle guard, but just as the captain of the guard could never become king, so the white man on the street will never become part of the in crowd. He can do their dirty work for him, but that's about all he's good for. And yet, for some reason, even though they know that this is exactly the structure that they've got, white people will gladly tell you, yeah, we fully recognize the structure that we're under. For some reason, nonetheless, these guys are all on code. You cannot get them off code. They're totally unified, and they're organized, and they follow and they carry out the dictates of their white leadership class. Even while grumbling about the fact that, well, I'm not one of the 1% yet, but you're doing their bidding now, ain't you? And you're fighting to maintain white supremacy at all costs. Now, why is that? Yes, the white rank and file have all bought into the agenda, but when the hell did this happen? These guys were at one another's throats back in Europe, and they went back at it for the entirety of the 20th century. So what changed? Well, what the feudal lords did was they brought some tangible benefits to their white peasantry for the first time ever. That's what changed. They had some tangibles that they were putting on the table. Prior to 1500, the only tangibles that the European warlords were promising was what they called security and order. Basically, it was nothing more than a clumsy front for a protection racket. Hey, we're going to make sure you peasants have someone to mediate your internal disputes, and we'll also make sure that the kings on the other side of the hill don't come over here and hurt you guys. But of course, these warlords were horribly cruel to the peasants, raping the women and girls, and the boys and men on many occasions, and summarily executing anyone who even looked at them the wrong way. And as for settling disputes, that was usually done in whatever manner benefited the king. So what the kings were doing was, when it suited them, they'd wipe out entire villages. When it suited them, look at the stories that you had about Europe, everything from Robin Hood to the Three Musketeers. It was all about a corrupt and malignant royal class, freely abusing and just maliciously and demonically, satanically torturing their own kinfolk. Wiping out entire groups of people simply on a whim, just because. And by the way, as for protecting the peasants from the mean king on the other side of the hill, what went unsaid in most cases is that oftentimes these so-called mean kings over there were in fact the cousins to the mean king over here, or in many cases even their own siblings. The European warlords offered no tangibles mainly because they didn't have any tangibles to offer. Go back and read Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. He talks about this. He points out over and over how his lord couldn't expect to command anyone's loyalty without showing that he was bringing some tangible benefits to the table. If you're a dishonest person, then you'll never keep your word, and nothing you say is true, so people aren't going to follow you. If you're an excessively greedy person, then you'll refuse to bring tangibles no matter how much you have, so no one's going to see the benefit in following you. And if you're a fool, then you'll wind up destroying yourself and anyone dumb enough to follow you. This is why honesty, generosity, and intelligence matters, because these are the foundations of getting people to follow you. This is the foundation of how you effectively lead a group for the long term. Now, the Europeans didn't have anything even remotely resembling civilization until the Romans showed up, and the Romans set a putrid, horrifying example for them. The European was bad off enough before the Romans showed up, and he was totally hopeless after the Romans left. Practically everything the European leaders have done since the Roman occupation is their own shabby imitation of the Romans, mixed with their own homegrown cave antics. The Romans brought technical benefits. They could finally move out of the caves and into a proper home and wear something other than blue body paint, but that was about it. That's about all that changed. The Romans did, however, bring an example of social order, however twisted, but the Romans also brought something else that the European had never had before: an organizing principle. Now, this is where the conversation gets a little deep, but I love that because that's how we run off the riffraff. That's how we get rid of the low IQ trolls and lurkers. Organizing principles are key to getting masses of people on the same page. And tangibles is the means by which you turbocharge your organizing principle, whatever that principle may be. And it's important that you get people doing what it is that you need them to do. As the old saying goes, we do not think our way to proper action, we act our way to proper thinking. Now, that may seem counterintuitive, but that's mostly for black folks who don't know how power is actually wielded. Organizing principles rely heavily on the use of symbols. Not only does it make it possible to organize masses of people around something, but if the principle is ingrained deeply enough, it can become cultural. The principle can go on for centuries, even millennia. You don't need to see Jesus in order to follow the teachings of Christ. All you need to see is the cross. The Romans certainly understood this principle. This was why the organizing principle they chose to use in Europe was religion, Christianity in this case. This would be used to indoctrinate the Europeans to accept the Romans' violent rule. The Romans sanctified their own sick, satanic, sadistic behavior, and they used the verses of the Bible to do it. Does that sound familiar? It was also used to get the conquered people to help the Romans take from other people. Religion was simultaneously a means and an end. The cross was the symbol used to unify people. This is certainly not to say the tribal warlords of Europe were all fine folks before those mean old Romans came along and set such a rotten example for them. Let's be clear, whatever bad habits the Europeans didn't already have, they picked up from the Romans. However, when the Romans left, the European warlords had no substitute for them. Europe's warlords had no technical benefits. They didn't have anything that they could bring to their own disheveled kinfolk. Europe has never been rich in natural resources. The noble families of Europe, such as they were in fact tribal chieftains, whose families ingratiated themselves with the Roman occupiers. They were trying to put on the airs of their Roman oppressors. That's where so many of Europe's so-called practices and institutions came from. It's them imitating what they learned from the Romans. After the Romans withdrew, the Europeans began fighting amongst themselves, or rather I should say they returned to fighting amongst themselves. Because when the Romans showed up, in many cases they didn't have to fight the Europeans at all. They just used the strategy of, hey, we know you got beef with those guys over there. You know, you're wearing blue body paint and those guys over there are wearing red body paint, so we'll help you go ahead and go after them. They would play on whatever animosities the Europeans had amongst themselves. And the European would replicate this exact same strategy when he came to the Americas. Even used it in Africa to a great extent. After the Romans withdrew, the Europeans went back to duking it out, to figure out which one of them was going to get what few fragments of Rome was left. And they soon figured out that there was nothing to get. The Romans used equal parts brutality and guile to manipulate the Europeans, and religion was the unifying principle that they employed. The Europeans tried their hand at this, but it failed. Religion can never truly be a unifying principle because it's simply too abstract. People begin disagreeing as to what religious doctrine means, and these disagreements are usually based on their own personal preferences. This is where the Anglican Church came from. King Henry, who gives a damn, he decided that he wanted to keep on the dating scene. He didn't want to have to give up the single life. And because of the fact that the Pope's representatives would not give him an interpretation of the Bible that would allow him to divorce, he decided, well, hell, I'll just make up my own freaking church. And the Anglican Church was born, the so-called Church of England, based on the sexual libertinism of a degenerate king, who most of the people in England to this day who even know who King Henry VIII was, even they don't like him. Now, when you apply this practice of bestowing divine privilege to the king on a tribal warlord society, then what you get is what Europe has. You get everyone claiming that God wants them to have what their neighbor possesses. They try to use religion in order to justify their own power desires. And we still see it today. So since Romans conquering Europe was all that the European tribal leaders knew, they decided to imitate that, and so the Europeans began invading one another's territories. This was easy enough to justify for them since they were all cousins to each other. They used that as a basis to wage war. They did it under the guise that they were supposed to inherit each other's kingdoms. Things like the Norman invasion of England was an example of this. And you can go all the way up into World War I. You had these guys who were cousins to each other. The King of England was from the House of Saxe-Coburg, which was German. And once the people were asking questions about that, he decided, we need to change names. Well, how are we going to change names? You know, our name is Saxe-Coburg. You know, we're Germans. That's our name, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Well, we're just going to say Windsor. Yeah, we're going to name it after the castle, Windsor. That sounds like a good English name, now don't it? It lets you know what a con all of this so-called European camaraderie is. What a con it is. But if a man is willing to lie about being descended from God himself, well, you can't really put anything past him. You just can't. It's one thing to lie about an invisible, intangible deity, but these guys began lying about things that everyone could see was clearly untrue. Every European warlord described his kingdom as a land flowing with milk and honey, where there's plenty of gold, food, and voluptuous females. But in reality, Europe is not quality farmland. Grass is about the only thing that grows there, so it's nobody's breadbasket. They have no mineral deposits of any note, and as for females, well, the less said the better. But just because these were total lies didn't mean that other people weren't gullible enough to believe it. European warlords always repeated the same pathetic dance, gin up a quickie excuse to invade one another's property, tell each other tall tales about how it's a dictator's paradise, send your impoverished ragtag peasantry to fight this other guy's impoverished ragtag peasants, and all you get is a plot of land that won't grow beans. All of them were so desperate to call themselves an emperor so that they could feel good about themselves. The Romans had an emperor, and he's the one who came and knocked us over, so we want to be emperors too. If they steal some land from a peasant farmer, they immediately crown themselves emperor of, well, who even cares? And they immediately would demand an audience with the Pope. I have exactly 1 square block of land, and I want a fist fight to get it, so I think that should be enough for the Pope to come and see me. I think I'm important enough. War has always been used by the Europeans and the Asians as a way to distract from the leadership domestic failures at home. When the economy is in the toilet, when the crops are failing and corruption is epidemic, just point to some foreigners and say, everyone, go over there. Distractions are an indispensable element of propping up corrupt systems. White supremacy does this all the time within the society, and they use black people as the scapegoats. When the so-called Holy Roman Empire gasped its last breath, the warlords of Byzantium decided to distract from the crumbling remnant of the empire by suddenly discovering religion. Seems there were some Muslims in Jerusalem, and for some unknown reason, this required all of Byzantium to go dogpile them. The Pope thought that there was some religious and mineral, read gold, capital to be gained, so His Holiness got all hot and bothered about it too. This is what led to the Crusades. Send the unwashed masses to go die in Western Asia, and the benefit was that it would get them out of the European warlords' hair for a while. This was a large part of why the European warlords were in total collapse at the end of the 15th century. For 1,000 years they were brawling with one another in the hills and caves of Europe. Then disease began to spread, and the few who survived that went back to fighting again. As for Europe's royalty, all they ever did was send their thugs into the countryside to collect taxes from peasants who didn't even have enough to eat. This is the picture of the European as the 15th century came to a close. They were in utter disarray because there were no benefits to following the white rulers of Europe. Now, this all changed with the decline of the Moorish Empire in southern Europe. The wall that kept the European contained had crumbled, and it also coincided with another tragic event. The Europeans stumbled across what would come to be called the New World. And since trouble usually comes in threes, the biggest disaster of all was gunpowder. The European would never have been able to get anywhere outside of Europe had it not been for the advent of gunpowder. And once the European was out, he immediately started getting into trouble. Started immediately seeing whose lands he could steal. Just Hispaniola alone, that's Haiti and the Dominican Republic, that was enough to bootstrap both the Spanish and the French economies. Just Hispaniola alone, just one island. That tells you just how sorry the situation was in Europe at that time. It was such a sorry situation, a mere island was enough to keep two greedy, corrupt bunches of thugs afloat. But it was the continental Americas that held the real prize, not just in terms of abundant natural resources, but also something far more important to Europe's despots, and that's a place where the European warlords could finally dump their dirty, angry masses of peasants. It's no coincidence that both the Americas and Australias, and any other places where the European could get a foothold, immediately were declared dumping grounds for Europe's prison population. And when you look at how many people they were sending by the boatload, you realize that their prison population was enormous. Because that's what you got to do when you have no resources. You got no tangibles to offer, and you're not a humane or just ruler. You wind up having to keep the prison industrial complex cherry. You ain't got jobs for anybody, but the prison sector happens to be the only growth industry. So the practice of throwing masses of people behind bars, why is it that the United States is the biggest debtor population? It happens to be the biggest prison population on the planet. China's got 6 times the population of the U.S., but the U.S. has more people behind bars. It's because this is a continuation of what they were doing in Europe. Once their little European feudal domain went global, they decided to use the exact same tactics. They have to. That's the only way that a system this sick and corrupt can stave off collapse just a little bit longer. Whole states in the U.S. and the 13 colonies and all of Australia would become debtors' prisons. And of course, debt, if you don't have any money at all, what winds up happening? They're not paying you anything. You can't get any sort of work. And what few pennies that you got don't buy anything, so what winds up happening is you wind up either stealing, which means they put you in prison, or you wind up borrowing money, but you can't pay it back because you didn't have any source of income in the first place, which means you also go to prison. It's a catch-22 because it's supposed to be. And these poor vagabonds put them to work laboring to bring their European masters the natural and human resources of these lands. They called it indentured servitude. That simply means short-term slavery. So once they had a little bit of resources, these European thugs who called themselves kings, they did something smart. They began to give their cast-off kinfolk some tangible benefits for the first time. mainly land in these other places. And that practice has been going on all along. The first land grants of the 16th century, that's just where it began. Continuing to try to incentivize Europeans to come to the Americas. Don't worry, you pick up some guns and help us kill some of these red folk out there who are black people in many cases. And we'll go ahead and let you have their land. And it continued all the way to World War II. Those white GIs who came back from Europe and from Japan, these guys at the government's, on the government's dole, which means black people, taxpayers, had to foot the bill for these white GIs coming back from the war to get housing grants, not loans. Give them housing grants. Give them free education. Don't give them educational loans. Just give them a free education. The GI Bill, just give them a free education. And through the SBA or some other criminal organization, you could go ahead and give these guys small business grants. Don't give them small business loans. Give them small business grants. This is what the white GIs got when they came back. These guys who were 19 and 20 years old coming back from Europe, a young white man coming back from the war, he got a free home, free education, and he could start a business for free. But it wasn't, of course, for free, because the black people were footing the bill. Black GIs didn't get any of that. So if you were white, a white man just 3 generations ago, in some cases, for some of you out there, not even that far back, but just a few generations back, just a mere 70 years ago, if you're white, the U.S. government made sure that they paid for you a house, which you were free to sell, which meant that you got all the equity out of it for free. They paid for you an education so you could make sure to get the skills you needed, whatever information you needed in order to have that leg up. And they even paid for you to start a business. Now, you know how much capital is freed up when a young man doesn't have to pay rent or a mortgage? When a young man doesn't have to spend his money on trying to get an education? When a young man doesn't have to try to save up to start a business? He doesn't have to sit here worrying about capital expenditures because the government's taking care of all of it. How much capital gets freed up for a young man when all he has to do is just execute because somebody else is paying the bill? Black folks are footing the tab. So you see, from the 16th century all the way up until the present, the practice of giving white people land, giving white people freebies to incentivize them to uphold white supremacy never stopped. And you'll have white people today saying, nobody ever gave my grandpappy nothing. He fought in the war, they didn't give our folks nothing. Yeah, but they leave out the parts where the government gave them everything. Now, they can go ahead and lie about it because it doesn't cost them anything to lie. But as a black person, you need to know exactly what it is that these guys have been getting so that you know what it is that black people have been deprived of. But this is what the European warlords in Europe and the U.S. did in order to organize their white brethren, in order to get the masses of white people on the same page. It started coming with some tangibles, but you can't do that without economics. Now, of course, all of these benefits that these thugs were giving their white kin were not theirs to give in the first place, but that made it even better. As far as the formerly besieged warlords of Europe were concerned, as they started shoveling their kinfolk onto those boats and saying, get the hell out of here, they got to have all of their demented little wishes come true, seemingly for free. They got to have control of free land, they got to have free political stability, and they got free labor in the form of the Africans forced to build Europe's wealth at the expense of our own. The Europeans didn't know much about how true power is wielded, but with the Catholic Church's mentorship they learned. It was the Catholic Church who did the most in order to kick off the slave trade. The European didn't know the intricacies of how power was most effectively wielded, but that's okay. The rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, they still had the rule book. They still had their little bag of tricks. They could dust off the playbook and say, here, we're going to show you what plays to run. Don't worry, you'll pick it up. The European had a number of ideas that he was using in order to establish himself now that he finally had some resources and some political stability to work with. This is why the Europeans spent so much time on universities. See, black people have told themselves, oh, that book learning stuff, man, that's just something for them white folks. No, the European understands why it is it's important to have universities. He learned the importance of universities from the Africans. Africans. The Africans had the oldest universities, not the European. Except the African didn't really have universities, he had omniversities. You learned everything when you went into an African house of learning. They taught you every freaking thing. And universities matter because these are the places where the well-to-do would send their children for the sake of learning how to rule and teaching their kids the technical skills necessary to perpetuate the state, that is, to perpetuate their power. Everything from shipbuilding, the first schools in Europe were geared around shipbuilding. Even in places like Russia, far away as Russia, they were concerned with shipbuilding. And the reason why was, now that the Moorish blockade had finally crumbled, they were like, we can get the hell out of here, but we ain't doing it across land. Because we have too many of those land borders we would have to pass. And, well, the European didn't know how to get along with each other, so still don't today. So what they were going to do was they were going to have to sail. And the seas were a little less treacherous, as long as you kept your distance from each other. But they also had schools teaching them agriculture for all the good it did them. Mostly their schools were teaching them things like warfare and economics, which at that time was considered to be one of the philosophies. Economics was considered to be one of the philosophies at that point. But that's what the European was teaching. The skill sets necessary to hold on to his power. He understood the importance of that. That it was important that you have institutions, and those institutions have to be funded and supported. You can't do that without economics. You will have no schools, and your students will have no means by which to learn without an economic foundation. So as greedy as these guys were, they were looking and going, you know what, if we're going to hold on to our power for the long term and to avoid the kind of messed up status quo we had back in Europe, we better make sure we start coming with some tangibles, and not just for a few. It'll be just enough to keep the former peasants of Europe from banging on our doors no matter where in the world they are. Just enough to keep them pacified. And you cannot understate the importance of institutions. Steve Kotkin once said that after a revolution, it's not the ideas that carry over, it's the institutions. A conversation or dispute that usually comes up whenever the issue of black empowerment takes place. You always got those white supremacists saying, well, the only successful slave revolt in history was the Haitian Revolution, but look at the Haitians today. See, that's Negro rule. No, that was Negroes who decided to place their economic fate in the hands of the Europeans. You might want to look up sometime whatever happened to Haiti's gold reserves. Most of you don't even know that the Haitians had them. The Haitians understood, at least some of them understood, that economics were important, but the problem was, as is so often the case, the Haitians were able to win the war, but they lost the peace. And why was it that the revolution was betrayed? Because you had a lot of Haitians, mostly mulattoes, who, as far as they were concerned, they were being treated somewhat differently, not that you could tell, but somewhat differently during French rule, and, well, they couldn't give up the idea that their grandfather or their grandmother, or for a few lucky ones, maybe their father raped their African mother, and they were the result of that, and, well, they couldn't let go of dear old dad. Okay, so dear old dad was killing us by the boatload just a few weeks ago, but he ain't all bad. The dude won't talk to you, he won't even look at you, but, we gotta reconnect the family tree, you see. That's what happened to the Haitian Revolution. Instead of focusing on building their economy, they were much more focused on acceptance from the Europeans. They gave up everything for it, even their gold reserves. See, they didn't put economics first. They put white acceptance first, and they paid a hideous price. And the Haitian Revolution was also not done any favors by the fact that there were no institutions in place. Remember, an institution is just a grouping of people who happen to be on the same page. It's an organization. An institution is not four walls with a roof, though in most cases it needs to be, but mostly the life's blood of an institution are the people who happen to be united either for a religious, educational, professional, or social purpose. That's an institution. Haiti, unfortunately, what institutions they had, they were not geared toward governmental power, ruling the state. You can have a religious institution, you can be teaching voodoo all you want, but voodoo is not geared around how do we organize our state. And if it is, it dang sure wasn't used for that, especially not used aggressively for that in Haiti. That's just a reality. You want to know why it is that the U.S. Revolution happened to be successful? It's because the institutions were in place before TJ and the boys decided that they were going to tell the King of England where he could stick it. All of the institutions were in place with the exception of a judiciary. And they did have a judiciary, it's just a matter of you had to follow whatever English common law was. But the United States had 7 men who held the title of president before George Washington. Now, granted, these men were not president of the United States. They were basically president of the colony. But there was already the office of a president, the idea of a president, before George Washington. And they already had a Congress. In fact, they had had 2 Congresses, a First Continental Congress and a Second Continental Congress, prior to the Constitution. Prior to the American Revolution, by the way. So they already had the executive branch. They already had the legislative branch, and Alexander Hamilton was the one telling them, hey, we can leverage debt. He was the one setting up their freaking stock market for them. The economics were in place. These were the guys who England was saying, go and collect our resources for us and manage the colonies. They had already been doing all the jobs required to run a country. The only thing that they didn't have was they didn't have the official title of power. And that's what they wanted. They wanted the power. These guys were essentially government ministers without portfolio, where they were like, well, hell, we want portfolios of our own. See, that's what they did. They made sure that they had their institutions in place. The universities were set up. Yale, Harvard, William and Mary, Princeton, all that stuff, already set up before the American Revolution. They had everything in place. They had their institutions in place. Institutions are crucial, because institutions are what preserve and promote ideas. You got yourself an idea, whether it's a new religion, whether it's some economic scheme, you got yourself some idea, some peculiar ideas about how the government ought to be organized and run, well, you're going to need an institution in order to preserve and promote that idea. That's the reason why think tanks have become so epidemic among the white well-to-do. They understand that you got to start pushing these ideas. But to make sure that the ideas don't get corrupted or don't get distracted or derailed, you need an institution, a group of people who are dedicated to the idea. A group of people who have brought enough resources in order to preserve that idea and to aggressively promote it so that the idea becomes dominant and endures. An institution, have you noticed that the institutions never change? The institutions may bring in new personnel, but what they don't bring in is new ideas. Institutions are not interested in new ideas. They're established in order to preserve pre-existing ones. See, that's what these good white folks were doing when they were organizing themselves. But no institution can be created, much less perpetuated, without resources. You think it's an accident that it's the well-to-do, from the Carnegies to the Mellons to the Jape to the Morgans to the so-called beer dynasty. I don't know what I've never drank beer in my life, but I don't know what the world you call that cow urine that they sell on store shelves. But you have the Coors family with a dyed-in-the-wool white supremacist Joseph Coors, who was giving money to the Heritage Foundation that he established and founded, when he wasn't giving money to other out-and-out white supremacist organizations like the John Birch Society or the White Citizens Councils. When he wasn't funding blatantly white supremacist organizations, he was setting up a slightly more sanitized white supremacist organization. See, that's what white men with power do. They understand that if they're going to remain in power, well, you gotta miseducate the public. You gotta also make sure to miseducate the political class, miseducate your academic class, miseducate your religious class. Make sure you get the idea that my power is sacrosanct. And let me explain to you why it is that my power should never be touched, never be interfered with. Oh, I'm going to go ahead and hire some academics, and they're going to come up with a bunch of good-sounding lies, utter gobbledygook, which is going to sound like intellectual nonsense. But the thing is, since I can't dazzle you with diamonds, if that doesn't work, don't worry. I'll baffle you with verbal and linguistic BS, better yet both. While I'm busy sitting here giving you all of this verbal diarrhea, let me go ahead and put a couple of shekels in your pocket. Now I know I got you on lock. But you can't do that without resources. Institutions are what preserve and promote ideas. Religions are promoted through churches, and a church is nothing more than a religious institution. Academic ideas like Egyptology or all the doctrines of black inferiority you've ever heard of, they came out of the universities. They're promoted through the universities, and a university is nothing more than an academic institution. Now, because of the fact that I don't want to just leave it at that, I want to make sure that the crux of this evening's conversation, which happens to be about the cowardice that so many black men are just too eager to spout about the destruction of the Black Wall Street and how, nah, man, economics ain't gonna work, the Black Wall Street. Before we go any farther, the white invaders suffered a huge defeat at the Alamo. Now, unlike the cowards who want to use the military defeats at the Black Wall Street as their excuse to surrender to white supremacy and bend over and grab their ankles, the white invaders instead turned the Alamo into a rallying cry. Isn't it interesting how that happens? Black people used to do that. If you have a victory, then you hold that victory up as these are our heroes who are getting things done. If you suffer a defeat, then that becomes a rallying cry. It doesn't become an excuse to give up. The Palestinians haven't allowed their almost countless defeats by the Israelis to deter them from still pushing to get their Palestinian real estate back. Why, they've even got some black folks who never ever advocate for black people out there pushing the Palestinian cause. Nobody telling the Palestinians, look at how many military defeats you suffered. 1948, 62, 71, 72, and 81, and every year since. They don't sit there saying the Israelis are sitting here beating you guys to death every day. Why don't you just give up? It ain't going to work. See, you never have black people sitting here saying, man, those Palestinians are such fools. They need to just accept it, man. It ain't going to work. Nah, they only save that kind of defeatist talk for black people. There have been many prior uprisings and attempts by the Haitians to throw off their chains. The Haitians had a number of uprisings and failed attempts at revolution prior to 1804. They all failed until 1804. Now, the Haitians have remained under economic and political siege ever since, and yet they remember Boukman and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. They remember their heroes and their fighters. Even on their knees, the Haitians still remember who fought for them to have their own. They remember that. They respect their fighters. If they don't win, at least revere them for having the guts to stand up and resist in the first place. Black people are dysfunctional about this. We seem to have a love-hate relationship with our heroes. We're not really sure what we think about any of our heroes. Nat Turner gets a movie and black folks are ambivalent. Well, them white folks, man, they might get the wrong idea. I wouldn't want them seeing me come out the movie theater, coming out the wrong theater on that, so I don't know. Yeah, you see, Nat Turner got up and fought for his. And a lot of black folks are looking to find excuses for not doing so, so Nat Turner rubs them the wrong way. No matter how long the dark night of oppression may be, those who want power, those who are worthy of their ancestors' sacrifice, will maintain the will to resist. Other people learn from their defeats. They don't hide behind them. Other people learn and they make adjustments and improvements so that next time, and there will be a next time that they decide to revolt and resist, this time they'll win, or at the very least, they're going to gain a little more ground. They don't look at every sort of fight as being just a one-and-done incident. To them, it's on a continuum. It's a marathon, not a sprint. It's a process, not an event. But then again, these other groups, they don't tolerate a treasonous traitor class amongst them either. So as black folks, we need to make sure that whenever we got some other black folks doing this defeatist talk, call them out for what they are. Recognize a traitor when you see one. No, just because your skin is dark don't mean that you got the right to speak. When you open your mouth, you need to be saying the right thing. The hour is too late. The time is too crucial and critical for us deciding that we're going to have a big tent and allowing every bit of idiocy to just get spouted. No, we need black folks to get their minds right. We need people to guard their speech a little bit better. And we need to be the enforcers and the guardians of a proper discourse within the black community. A discourse that is going to be unabiding, a discourse that is going to be open to being uncomfortable for the right folks, because it's going to be a discourse that is going to be uncompromising. Because if you're going to compromise on the discourse, then that means you're also going to compromise on your power. You're going to compromise on what you get. You're going to compromise on everything. If you compromise on the words, it goes without saying that you've already surrendered where your actions are concerned. And over here, for those of us who are living the B1 life, compromise, that's the other guy's job.